The live. There it is. All right. Perfect. I guess we're live. Hello, everyone. I'm Hannah, the event coordinator for Books Inc., an independent bookstore out in the San Francisco Bay Area. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists who have come together from all over the country to celebrate Asian and Pacific Islander American Book Month with a discussion on the complexities of writing the Asian American experience from immigrants, refugees, and second-generation Americans. Joining us today, we have Traci Chee, whose upcoming YA historical fiction, We Are Not Free, comes out on September 1st. And next we have Lori Lee, whose upcoming epic YA fantasy, Forest of Souls, hit shelves June 23rd. And then we have IW, or Eileen Gregorio, author of the new YA rom-com, This Is My Brain in Love, which is available in stores now. And rounding out the panel, we have Deeba Zargarpur, an editor at Simon & Schuster Books for young readers and Salam Reads, an imprint that centers Muslim main characters as the heroes of their own stories. Before passing it on to these amazing panelists, I just want to thank you all on behalf of Books Inc. and remind all of our listeners that Traci, Lori, and Eileen's books are all available to purchase at www.booksinc.net and that we have free 7-day shipping and we ship nationwide. Also, you can tune in for more panels throughout the month. Check out the full schedule on AsianAuthorAlliance.com. Now I'm just going to pass it over to Eileen.
Hello, how are you, everybody? We're so grateful to have everybody in this virtual gathering of such amazing people. We're going to actually sort of start off by introducing ourselves sort of chronologically based on when our families came to the U.S. because the story of this is hopefully going to be able to show the diversity of the Asian American diaspora and how varied our stories are. And so first chronologically is the amazing Traci Chee.
Hi, I'm Traci Chee. I'm the author of We Are Not Free, which comes out in September. This is a young adult historical, loosely inspired by some of my family's stories from the Japanese American incarceration in World War II. And my family came here in like the 1910s, 1920s. They were like working class gardeners, shipping clerks, that kind of thing. And so they lived here through kind of like the roaring 20s and into the Great Depression, and then World War II hit. And at that point, they were incarcerated with more than 100,000 other people of Japanese descent. And so my grandparents, who were 13 and 16 at the time, spent some of their most formative teenage years behind these barbed wire fences and these desolate incarceration camps in the American interior. They got out in about 1945 and then have really, to some extent, I think, lived the idealized American dream, pulled themselves up from their bootstraps, raised families. My grandparents, all of their grandchildren graduated from universities, which I think is pretty cool. And so that's kind of that family story.
That's amazing to think of the century that your family has been here, because for me, I've always felt like, like my family is such a newcomer. And my story is kind of odd in that I often say that I'm the least Chinese person you'll ever meet. I actually grew up with my grandparents because my family, my mom and dad divorced when I was very young. And that the grandparents that I grew up with, my grandfather and my grandfather and grandmother, even though they're both of Asian descent, my grandmother grew up in the tiny island of Mauritius, which is a tiny island in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Madagascar. And my grandfather was actually born in South Africa. His family was part of the Asian diaspora that went to South Africa during the gold rush. And so that he grew up in Durban, a port city, and his family was sort of the prototypical, impoverished family that owned like this small corner grocery store. And my grandfather would tell stories about how they'd buy butter to sell. And then if it weighed over a pound, they would cut off like a little millimeter of it and then use it for themselves. That was how frugal they were. My grandfather got lucky. He got one of I think only 5 spots for colored people, as the Asians in South Africa were termed, in medical school at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. And so he was able to go to medical school, become a doctor, and then become part of the British medical service. And was able to leave South Africa and move to Malaysia. And they lived there, they flourished there for, a couple of decades and raised a family. But then in the 70s and late 60s, there were actually race riots in Malaysia as well. And so largely because of the conflict between the Chinese and Muslim populations in Malaysia. They decided to finally immigrate to the United States once again. So they're twice immigrants. And there, my father went to college and graduate school and met my mother, who's actually native Hokkien Taiwanese. So not the wave of people from China who went to Taiwan after the Cultural Revolution or after the revolution, but who've been there for centuries, and so are a bit more integrated and have their own sort of pseudo language, their own dialect of Taiwanese. So I grew up in upstate New York, though, and I'm completely, as you can see, Americanized. I'm a total banana, as they say, yellow on that one in the inside, and it took me a long time to reclaim my culture. You know, I learned Mandarin in college, even though I was supposed to go to Chinese school. I never really went. And for a long time, I remember I didn't have sushi until I was in high school. And I remember that I didn't have dim sum until well in my high school years. And so it's been a long process of, several decades of reclaiming that part of my life and reclaiming the stories of my culture. I think Lori's next. No, Deeba's next.
Hello. I mean, those are such amazing stories. I love hearing everyone's origin stories. My name is Deeba Zargarpur, and I'm an editor at Simon & Schuster Salam Reads and Books for Young Readers. My family's origin story started, I would say, originally in the 1930s, where my grandfather actually had immigrated from Uzbekistan into Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion. And both sides of my family actually they all moved from Uzbekistan into Afghanistan, and they lived there for quite a long time during a really empowering moment in Afghanistan's history. The Afghanistan of my parents and my aunts and uncles' childhood was really a progressive one and a very liberated and powerful Afghanistan. Unfortunately, though, the history with Afghanistan, though, it's been kind of like a game piece in what's called the Great Game, where it's really kind of been like this chess piece that both the Soviet Union and England have kind of been vying for. There's kind of this idea that whoever controls Eurasia controls the world, and Afghanistan, because it is so landlocked and in such a unique position, that basically controlling this one area in Asia really connects Asia into Europe. So because of that, there's been a lot of war. And when the Cold War was happening around the 1970s, that's when the Soviet Union was pretty much invading its Afghanistan. And that's when my family in batches started leaving around 1978 until around 1984. And what's interesting about that is, I've always heard stories from my aunts and uncles and even my parents, how did you feel about that? Leaving your homeland and going to this new place. And they're like, we didn't even know. So apparently what my grandparents had done was they had, in batches sent children, my mom and my aunts and my uncles to America saying, you're going on vacation, because apparently the situation was very difficult during that time. So if the Soviet soldiers had caught wind that you were actually leaving permanently, it wasn't really a good look. So my mother, when she packed up and she went, she's like, I thought I was going for a couple weeks. But once they arrived in JFK, it became very clear that once they entered customs, they had been basically, my grandmother had coached them into saying that, the first thing that you say once you land in the airport is I'm here asking for a political asylum. And that's kind of how my family's origin story into the States happened. And then, so basically around that time, everyone kind of just settled into Long Island. And what's really beautiful now is, since I'm first generation American, born and raised here, is that so much of my community came around the same time and then moved into the same area. So it's kind of like, even though they left home, they brought home with them and started new in this country. And that's been, for me, a really beautiful thing, because it helps me feel connected to my cultural roots, even though I will probably never visit Afghanistan because of the current situation. And the Afghanistan of my family's youth it no longer exists. And so like that kind of brings a lot of complicated and bittersweet feelings as well. Yeah, that's it.
That's awesome. Hi, I'm Lori Lee. I'm the author of Forest of Souls, which comes out June 23rd. So I am Hmong, which is a ethnic minority that's sort of spread out throughout China, southern China, and Southeast Asia. I was born in Laos during the Vietnam War, the very end of the Vietnam War. And so during the war, the CIA recruited Hmong soldiers to rescue downed American pilots in like the mountains. And my father was actually one of the soldiers recruited, and he died. But we call it the secret war because it's not taught in history, and it's not something that most people know. But towards the end of the war, when America pulled out, when the U.S. pulled out of Vietnam and Laos and that whole area down there, the Hmong were sort of just left to fend for themselves, and and because they had, you know, joined this war, and they were left behind essentially. They became targets of the Pathet Lao. So the government or the Pathet Lao were just basically sweeping through the mountains and like taking Hmong prisoner and burning villages, and it was pretty awful. So the Hmong began to flee the mountains and cross the Mekong River into Thailand, which was neutral. So my family did that. My father had just recently died. I was just like a month old. And my mom, it was her. It was like me and like my 6-7 siblings, just like going through the jungles of Laos. And then we eventually made it. We crossed the river, and luckily we were found by some Thai locals who helped us, versus because there were some people who crossed the river and then they were found and they were turned over back to the Laotian government. But fortunately, the Thai locals who found us helped us, and then we lived on a refugee camp. I think there were 2 or 3 very large refugee camps in Thailand, specifically for the Hmong. I lived there for a couple years, and then I think I was in Bangkok for like 6 months while we were waiting to get all our paperwork sorted out for relocating to America or to the US. We had to be sponsored. So my mom's brothers had gone first, and then I guess they were there for a number of years, and then they got help from I don't remember specifically because I was so young, and we don't really talk about this too much. But we were sponsored by an American family as well. And the nice thing about my uncles going first is that everybody all sort of just settled in like the same areas. So there's very, very concentrated communities of Hmong in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and California. And then that's in the US. And then there were also communities of the Hmong who went to France and Australia, I believe, because they were allies to the US at the time. But yeah, so my family came over mid-1980s. I think it was 1985. Not entirely sure about that because I don't actually remember much. But it was just really interesting growing up, right? Like the formative years, the years that I remember growing up right after that move, because the Hmong were just so set on holding on to their traditions and like holding on to the language, and they were very strict on like certain things, like you have to speak Hmong when you're at home, you have to behave this certain way, you have to treat your elders this way. Anything negative you do reflects on the clan, the family, the whole family. You always have to be conscious of family reputation. Family face is what we call it. But then I was so there was that. and then within the larger American U.S. community, where I would go to school and and we speak only English, and the U.S. culture was just so different. So it was just a very weird thing where I wanted to fit in because I wanted to assimilate. I wanted to fit in because I didn't know anything else. What I remember, I don't remember like much from Thailand and Laos, or if anything. So this country is what I know, but like I grew up in this community where it's like you have to behave in a way that is completely different from what I've always known, like outside of this. So it was very strange. But like it's been really weird as well watching the Hmong community evolve over the last couple decades, just because there's that resistance at first to assimilate, because the majority of the Hmong people who came here didn't really come here willingly. They came here because they really literally didn't have a choice. It was either come here or stay there and be hunted through the jungle. There were a lot of people who didn't make it. And as the longer that we've been here, the more people have settled, and the more they've sort of just decided this is life now. This is what we're going to do. Because for a long time, there was a lot of hope that they could go back. In the communities, they were just like, they wanted to go back to their mountain villages. They wanted to go back to their land, because they had large tracts of like beautiful mountain like gardens like along the mountain sides, and just like rice paddies. It was beautiful. I've seen pictures, but yeah, the longer that the Hmong community's been here, it's just you get comfortable, and you get used to a certain way of life, and then the old way of life just feels farther and farther away.
I feel yeah, okay.
Sorry. And there have been instances where the Hmong who have gone back to Laos just to visit, there have been instances where they've gone missing, because there's still that old that grudge between the Hmong communities and the government because of what they did. And there are definitely cases where Hmong elders have wanted to go visit their old villages, and they've gone missing.
Thank you for talking about that, Lori, because I feel like there's the first time I ever heard about the Hmong people were in medical school. There was actually a book called The Spirit Catches Us and We Fall Down, which is this fascinating story about a Hmong family and the tensions between them and the medical community when one of their kids had epilepsy. And so, I mean, it's a story that I never heard of until I was in my 20s, 30s. And so I think one of the things that is sort of common through all of our books potentially is the need to tell these stories that we didn't necessarily hear when we grew up. And I would love to just talk about that, and Deeba, talk about what you as an editor are trying to do with Salam Read. Like, again, your catchphrases that you're allowing Muslim readers to be the heroes of their own stories. I mean, I can't even remember growing up. I can only remember one book growing up that had a Chinese American character, and it was interesting. It was Betty Bow Lord's Jackie Robinson, and The Year of the Born Jackie Robinson, which I love. It's an adorable story, and still in print right now. But in many ways, even though it basically had someone who looked like me on the cover, it wasn't really my story, because it was the story of a girl growing up in Chinatown, New York City, is very different from a story of a girl growing up in upstate, like central New York, like the the Alabama portion of New York. Like New York is New York City and Buffalo and Alabama in between. And I definitely lived in the Alabama portion, which was very conservative, and I was one of only 2 or 3 people of color. And so I love hearing your stories about how all of your communities really sort of migrated en masse. So you're able to retain that culture, even though you're in a new country, because I never felt like I had that growing up. And the cultural loneliness, the feeling that you had to, you were sitting on this divide between multiple cultures and trying to struggle for your identity is so key to the stories that I've been I try to tell, and this is My Brain in Love, where both characters are kind of POC who, face microaggressions and have to, especially, there's this idea of minority stress, that people of color have, having to experience microaggressions, having experienced poverty, and financial stress, like, actually become physically stressed, and like that impacts everything. And we are seeing now with COVID how COVID is disproportionately hitting, people of color because of the minority stress that they feel. So are you guys interested in talking about how your books discuss that? Really?
Yeah, I actually thought I found like a very interesting thread between what you said, Eileen, and like what Lori brought up. Eileen, you mentioned the word banana. I've also heard Twinkie, right? Yellow on the outside, white on the inside. And then Lori talked a bit about assimilation. And I think the idea that an immigrant from another culture comes to the United States and that there is some kind of overarching American culture, usually like white, right? That we should become a part of and like blend into as much as we can to be accepted here is really fascinating to me, because I think that the way that we assimilate is so different. For example, when my Japanese family came here at like early in the 1900s, right? They could only live in kind of Japanese American communities. Those tended to be in the cities where the jobs were, and where Japanese Americans were already living. And then kind of the war happened and these communities were ousted from where they had started to put down roots for decades. And then there was this new pressure to assimilate into American culture, right? People could leave the camps. They could get special permission to leave the camps. And they would be kind of spread out through kind of the middle of the country in the East Coast, Detroit, Chicago, Denver, New York City. And these were the places that they were allowed to go, but they didn't really have that like strong community of Japanese people that they had been used to, first in there where they had come originally and then in the camps. So, but that was the way that they could get their freedom, right? Was by assimilating. And so it became like this, I think, a bit of a divisive issue between the generations, kind of the older generation who didn't have American citizenship, who mostly had to stay in the camps, and then this younger generation who's going out into the rest of the country. And so we had that, right? We had that, and it's heartbreaking to me that we had these communities, and then because of like US government policies, those communities were forced to break up. And I feel like there was a lot that was lost in that transition: language, traditions, the way that we kind of celebrate holidays, connections to our families in Japan. And so that kind of pressure to assimilate made me feel often like I was a Twinkie or like a banana, right? And because I had lost it. And then it's actually books like You're the Boring Jackie Robinson, or I also read The Best Bad Thing by Uchida when I was young. And these specifically deal with characters trying to kind of negotiate their pressure to assimilate into like white America, right? And then their kind of their home cultures. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about kind of how all of your families navigated that really complex issue.
Definitely. I know what Eileen had said before about, feeling disconnected, and me on the opposite end, really being born into this large community. Like, to put it into perspective, my mother's side alone, she has she has 8 sisters and 2 brothers. And they all came, and they came with their children. And then my grandmother's siblings, and their children, and then their cousins, they all kind of came around the same time. And so they all just kind of like settled in this one area, in like the same neighborhood. They just like built, back then, like Long Island was really just grass. Like there wasn't anything, it was just like the wild. And they just kind of like created their own neighborhoods. It's actually really funny because some of my extended family, they have literally a neighborhood called like Quadra Court, and it's like the whole entire family, like the street is named after their entire family. And it's really interesting because you have like this literal community that came during like the same time. And it's like you have like hundreds and hundreds of these Afghan Uzbeks that came and kind of just brought life with them. And I think it's interesting, this idea of assimilation, because I think when people come to when people have come to America, it's either like they assimilate and they just want to be known as American, or they really hang on really, really, really tight to their culture and their language. And my family did that. They really wanted to hold on tight. I think, you know, the need to move to America was of necessity, you know, it was for safety. So what Lori was saying is like, really, the idea was always to go back. No one ever really wanted to leave. It just became unsafe. But then as we know, the current situation now, unfortunately, like no one in my family has ever gone back. And I think, you know, there was a moment in time where everyone kind of had to think like, this is permanent, like this is our future. This is the homeland that we want. No longer exists, and like how do you deal with those complicated feelings, which then me growing up was very interesting because you know, my family, they were very much so like, yes, you live in America, but you're not going to speak English, you're going to speak Farsi, you're going to know your mother tongue because you need to be connected to this homeland that is us. Like, you know, we are Afghan through and through. And there was always like this fear of losing this bittersweet like memory of what home was for them, because it's strange to think that, you know, my family wants me to hold on to this idyllic childhood vision of their home, and it only exists in their minds and it only exists with them. You know, even me going to visit or turning on the news, it's not the same. And I think that fear of like losing forever the home they loved is very visceral and very close to their hearts, which for me growing up, you know, I think when I was younger, I took it for granted because I was just like, but I want to be American. You know, I felt like there was this living of two worlds, like, you know, having this big, huge community that took up all of my time. And then once I started to get older and then start school, you know, I was in ESL, even though I was born and raised here, you know, I didn't speak very good English. I had to learn English through school. And that's kind of like an interesting thing to think about, like how strong that grip was to not lose, you know, who we are. And I think getting older, like that really brings a lot of complicated feelings, because then it does get to the point where as I was getting older, I felt this clear divide in who I was at home and who I was to the outside world, and trying to navigate that was very difficult, because then I started wanting to assimilate more and more, because, you know, as we all know, there weren't any characters that looked at me. There weren't any Afghans, you know, kicking butt in fantasy stories or in contemporary fiction. I mean, even now the options are very limited. And so never seeing my face represented, it really made me think, well, if I can't see my face, then what am I supposed to do here? Like, if my story is not important, then which story is important? And then it's like wanting to assimilate into that important story because, you know, as a child, you want to feel connection.
Mm-hmm. I would love to talk about how we can hold on to our cultures. And I think that it's going to be different for all of us, because as I was saying, I felt I had to spend a lot of my life learning, getting that culture. But like, I think that one of the ways in which is a shortcut, I think, for culture is food. And I mean, I love Japanese food. I love Vietnamese and Thai food. And in Deeba, one of my favorite restaurants in the entire world is called Kabul Afghan Cuisine in the Bay Area.
Oh my
God. Every time I go back to the Bay Area, I go there because they have this amazing pumpkin stew. And like, I feel like food is a really important part in a lot of how we represent our cultures in writing. I mean, certainly this is My Brain Love is like that. They've been dubbed a foodie rom-com, but like, I mean, I also think about books like, I mean, even the Joy Luck Club or Crazy Rich Asians, you know, there's the ability to not just only reclaim your culture, but to share it and give it to others. Because like, I feel like in my, as an adult, I've grown into this process where I finally, once I become proud of my ethnicity, I can begin to share it and begin to spread the love for these diverse types of food, these like incredible cultural aspects that other people really, I mean, some people assimilate it, you know, that they culturally assimilate it, but other people use it as a touchstone, as like something to hold on to ground them, but also to sort of spread this idea that multiculturalism is a goal. You know, I mean, obviously the world is complex, and globalization is can be a controversial issue, but I can't help but think that, you know, the world can only be stronger through the exchange of culture. And for me, food is a really important aspect of that.
I agree. And I think what's fascinating in talking to other people is always what they have at Thanksgiving, right? Because like my family has turkey, mashed potatoes, kind of these American staples. But then we also have, like, we always have Dungeness crab, which is like a California specific, Northern California specific food. And then we always have, at New Year's, we make mochi. So like these kind of traditions, I think, from, and often through food, can integrate. And so that's definitely a way. And so I mentioned it too in We Are Not Free. Like, yes, we are eating turkey at Thanksgiving and stuffing, but we also have like mac salad. That's like a Hawaiian thing from like when my family was in Hawaii before they came to the mainland. So like, yeah, definitely.
So I think, Lori, I would love for you to talk about how writing fantasy is, because I think in contemporary or historical, it's like a little bit more easy to write your culture into it. But like, what was it like creating your fantasy world, and how did you change it based on your experiences and your culture?
So the thing about my writing is that it took a really long time for me to give myself permission to even use anything from my own culture, because we talk about the assimilation and, like, you know, wanting to fit in, and growing up reading fantasy, like loving fantasy and seeing that fantasy didn't have a place for people like me. It You internalize that, and I was convinced that if I wanted to write fantasy, I could not write about people like me. They had to be white, basically. So it took a very long time for me to break that thought process, because that really gets into your head, you know. So once I did, I think it was actually just last year that I finally gave myself permission to just be like, I'm gonna write a Hmong character who is Hmong, and like it's a contemporary fantasy, but who is Hmong and who is of this community, and I'm just not gonna worry about like what people think about it. I'm just gonna go for it, because what held me back as well, I mean, in addition to like getting over that initial hurdle, what held me back was that as far as I know, there are no mainstream fantasy books with Hmong culture in it, like, at all. So if I was gonna do this thing, I felt this pressure to portray the culture in a way that would make the community proud, and that would also not offend anyone, because culture is just, you know, culture is so deeply ingrained in all of us, right? And also, because I had fought so hard against my own culture when I was young, and I wanted to assimilate so badly, I didn't really have that groundwork to even work with. Even though my culture or my community and my family wanted us to behave a certain way and to remember cultural practices and the language and all that stuff, I fought against it. And I used to speak Hmong fluently, and now I can barely speak it at all. So if I was going to do this, I wanted to do it right. And I wanted to do it in a way that respected the culture. Sorry, that respected the culture. And I just didn't know if I could do that, partly because I didn't have the knowledge and because I didn't know what the community would think. The Hmong community is very tightly knit. Like everybody knows everybody. So I didn't want to disrespect the culture that way. But then, you know, it was just a couple years ago, and I'm like in my 30s. So this took a very long time for me to like work all this stuff out. Just a couple years ago, I was just like, if I'm going to write my culture, it's my culture to do with what I want. And this is fantasy. This is if traditionally Western cultures get to disseminate their stuff and like twist folk tales and flip stories upside down, then why can't I? Why can't I do that with my culture? So I did. So I was just like, I'm not going to worry about it. I wrote a story last year that's contemporary fantasy with a Hmong protagonist who goes into the spirit realm to find the spirit of her brother, and I just made stuff up. And I took Hmong folk tales and I picked up characters, and I took Hmong themes and I just ran with it, and I had so much fun doing it. And hopefully it'll be well received. And if not, I'm sorry. I guess, you know, I wanted to write a story where that gave Hmong people a place in fantasy, because we've never had a place in fantasy.
This ties really in. So we have some really amazing questions in the live comments. And so I want to bring out Amy Ng's question. Do you worry about whether or not your story is too cultural? Because obviously you just talked about that. And the intended audience won't be able to understand certain ideas, especially with mythology and folklore. And my initial thing with that is that in some ways with fantasy, you have the leeway to create things whole cloth, right? I mean, how many fantasy books, even based on Western cultures, have we read where like names are completely incomprehensible, and like it's all about world building? If the author creates that world, people are going to follow. I mean, I don't really understand the idea that things will be too cultural and too specific, because that specificity great joys of reading, right, is discovering things that are unfamiliar to you. And Deeba, do you mind talking about this from the perspective as an editor? Do you ever get this concern from, say, marketing or publicity that, you know, because I remember, I know that it's a very prevalent thing within the YA community that foreign rights are apparently harder to sell for diverse books because they are thought to not be universal. And there's this like conventional wisdom about this, but then there are really diverse movies and pictures and movies and books that are very well received overseas. So I feel like it's kind of a myth that people aren't open to books by other cultures.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, in my personal opinion, like nothing can be too cultural. I mean, I feel like as an editor, I'm always looking for stories by diverse creators who, you know, inject all of their culture, all of their language, all of whatever you want. Like, I think to me, that's what makes the story special. Like, you know, that's what makes the story, you know, so beautiful, especially because, you know, especially the fantasy market has been so predominantly one note, I guess you would say. You know, growing up, I had always assumed that, you know, fantasy was always with white characters, and they always had to have Christmas, and they always had to have, like, you know, these staples. And that growing up and now being an editor, I realized, you know, that's so wrong. Actually, there's so much mythology, so much folklore just like waiting for to be picked up, because I think there is the audience. You know, the world is huge. We are not a monolith. We are all so different. We all have beautiful stories. And I think, especially being at a publishing house, I can understand some of the pushback with foreign rights, but I feel like that's less of an issue of audience wanting these books and more of just, you know, diversifying, you know, the face of publishing in general. You know, I think when there is pushback from sales and marketing, it just means that we just need to really work hard on promoting, you know, people of color to enter the industry and really give voice to these important stories. And I think once we have more advocates, we'll see more change, more growth in the stories that are being put out. So, I mean, in short, I think too cultural doesn't exist to me.
I think there's an interesting line to tread as a writer of like, how much can I say that people within a community will automatically get and be on board with, and then how much do I need to explain for people who are outside of that community? And that's something that I could feel myself navigating in We Are Not Free. There's a scene where my characters are making takawan in one of their barracks, and takawan is a sweet Japanese pickle, and I didn't like, they don't need to know like super that much about like what takawan is actually made out of and like how to do it. They need to know it's a pickle. They need to store food for kind of what's coming up because there are food shortages in the camps, and kind of that's the core of that scene. And so I didn't go on and explain, if you know what takawan is, great. And if you don't, they're making pickles because they're going to run out of food at some point. So like, that's kind of the question I ask myself, is how much do people need to know who aren't in this community to understand what's happening in the story? Whereas if you are in the community already, it's just like a fun extra, like, ooh, hello, this is for me, which I think is so wonderful as a reader too.
Ridiculous Blog had a question, Traci, that I think might be mostly directed towards you. It's because these experiences happen to your family, do you ever hesitate to use them in your stories because they're private? Or do you think it's more important to tell these stories, to share the experience?
I love this question. Thank you for asking it, because it's definitely something that was on my mind as I was researching it, and as I was drafting it, and as I was revising it. Some of the, like, We Are Not Free is loosely inspired by some of my family's stories from the camps, but there's no one-to-one, oh, that character is my grandma, or like, oh, this exactly happened in this exact context. I could give you an example. In the 4th chapter, there's a character named Betty, and she really just wants to kind of live her fabulous 16-year-old, I'm going to dances, I'm flirting with boys kind of life. And so I gave her kind of this moment from my grandmother's life, where my grandmother, when she was in the camp, she was 13 years old. She was like really kind of running wild. She was a little bit of a wild child, even for back then. She would sneak out at night and like steal her older sister's clothes and then put them back dirty, like stuff them back into the drawer. And so my grandma has this story from after she was out of the camp. She was in beauty school. She wore a blonde wig home, and her dad, my great grandfather, was so angry. This is like the late 1940s. He was like, you dyed your hair. And he just like screamed at her for a very long time. And she stood there and took it, and like her smile got like bigger and bigger and bigger, until finally she ripped off this wig, and she was like, ha, it's just a wig. Ah. And so that happened to my grandmother. I gave that story to this character, Betty, who's like very into kind of looks and hair and makeup. But you wouldn't look at Betty and be like, that's Traci Chee's grandmother. You know what I mean? So being able to transform kind of these family stories through the writing of fiction, I think is where I went with it. And then some things I just didn't include. I was like, this is too private, so I'm not gonna mention that. And I also kind of went back and talked to the relatives that I interviewed, and I was like, look, here's the manuscript. I'd like you to take a look at it and be one of the first readers. And if there's really anything you object to, please let me know, because now is the time when I can edit, I can revise it and take those things out. But I found, were very interested in having their stories told, in sharing what happened in this kind of corner of American history. And so that was a beautiful thing too. I think Eileen mentioned, like, now is the time when we get to share our culture and our experiences. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, privacy is an interesting thing, right? Because you want people to allow space to feel their things. And of course, fiction does allow you to tell stories through other people's points of view, to not anonymize it. But I think that what I get concerned about when we don't tell our stories is that it goes from privacy to secrecy and shame. And like particularly, and this is in My Brain in Love, because there's a lot in it about mental illness. One of the themes in the book is that sometimes privacy and the inability for different generations to talk about their stories is incredibly harmful. Because I grew up in a family where anxiety and depression were very much taboo, where I didn't grow up with a language to talk about these issues. And if I had known that my grandmother suffered from depression, if I had known that my stepfather almost was incapacitated and had to move countries because of his depression, if I had known that one of my granduncles who was in a mixed race marriage, who was in a multicultural marriage, their mixed race daughter committed suicide when she was 17. Like, I feel like this I would have been able to at least get to the point of diagnosing my own anxiety and depression a lot earlier. But because it was considered too private to even mention in passing and to even begin to process, like, I feel like that type of silence is incredibly harmful to certain communities. And I feel like it's really important to share these experiences. And luckily in fiction, it is possible to anonymize it. It is possible to give these stories to other people. And that's kind of our role as writers, I think, to be able to transform our families' experiences and create narratives and dialogues that hopefully, will be healing to future generations.
I agree. And now, in case anyone has a burning question, now's the time to ask questions. In our chat, did Deeba or Lori, did you want to jump in on some of these questions we already have?
I think definitely it's what Eileen was saying about, whether or not you feel like a story is private or if it could be misconstrued, the silence is shame. I think definitely there is a really tough line. I think, my family has always been like, for as long as I can remember, they're like, your grandparents, they had the most epic love story, epic journey, escaping war. Like, these are such important stories. Like, someone should write them down. Someone. And then I remember just for therapy for myself in a way, just trying to figure out and untangle the story, I started to write them down. And then I noticed that once stories are about our family history have been written down, then there is a little bit of hesitance of, don't write that, don't do that. Like, my great grandfather, he had actually, during when they were living in Afghanistan, he had an import-export trade, and it was not doing so well, and it was they were falling on hard times. And back then, and even now, like, family name and reputation really was everything. And losing that respect in a community really, really was this big thing. And he had actually, committed suicide. Part of it was because of that. And it's like, that's not something that was ever really talked about. And when I had written that part, they're like, it's a little bit uncomfortable, because like Eileen was saying, mental health is not something that's talked about. And if it is talked about, it's not in the way that you would think is productive. Whereas like, oh, this happened because there was a jinn and something else had happened to him. It's not because there was any other issues other than maybe some external force that, caused his depression or something like that. So I think, there is importance in shedding light to these stories in a way that is honest and maybe a little raw and a little painful, but important, especially when the narrative, is right now so limited.
I saw a couple questions about writing and trying to avoid stereotypes. And I thought that might be a great kind of jumping off point for us. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately, especially I read this book called The Making of Asian America, which is like a very big overview of Asian Americans in this country. Very big. I feel like it leaves a couple communities out, and that is a sad thing, but it's an overview. Anyway, I've been very interested in when people came here and how that affected their experiences. And so when you're thinking about creating your characters, I would suggest thinking about when they got here and kind of into what situation they came, and then like also what situation they left, if they had a community here, because I think all of those things will influence kind of how their culture infiltrates into their day-to-day life. Yeah. And I feel like, Eileen, you might have, since you write contemporary, some more.
Yeah. I mean, so in my two main characters, like each of them, I tried to give their own little thing. One of the person's thing is journalism, so he sees everyone through a journalism look. But my Asian character, I actually have her, she's an aspiring filmmaker, and so she always thinks about tropes. And so one of the things that was really fun about writing these books was identifying all the Asian tropes that I was either, latching onto or trying to subvert. The trope of the person of color's family owning a restaurant, check mark. The tropes of the overbearing father, check mark. But like all of those, I feel in some ways were inverted near the end, and that was sort of one of my goals. But it's really, really challenging because like I'm a living trope, right? I am an Asian American who played the violin and went to medical school, but at the same time, I'm an Asian American who like decided to like become an author who, and a lot of Asian kids are considered to be really conservative and tight knit. And I'm a urologist, so you can insert your joke here, So I think that you can allow your characters to have some stereotypical aspects as long as you're able to show the other ways in which they are more complex and different. I mean, every person's, life is a giant trope. One of the things that they say about TV tropes is that tropes are neither good nor bad, they just are. And the bad thing is when someone is defined by their trope and you don't see any depth behind that. And but at the same time, it is really fun to do things like in my book, there are two main characters, and it's actually the mixed race Black identifying kid who is the kid who's straight A's and whose parents are a doctor. So, I love doing things like that as well. But certainly stereotypes exist for a reason, but they're just never the single story.
I would also add to that, like, I don't know if it's when my family came here or my family's just super cool, but I never got the doctor, lawyer, engineer pressure, right? That was not a part of my experience. And I wonder if it's because we came here at that like specific time in history that pressure just, it wasn't a thing. Like the 1965 Immigration Act hadn't been passed yet, like encouraging more like highly educated immigrants to come here. So like, it really depends, right? And then I also wanted to tack on, if you have more than one, that really helps, right? So that one character isn't standing like for all Asian people, right? And I think that helps too, because it gives you more room to play.
Yeah, Traci, yours with your 14 points of view. Talk about negating all the stereotypes. Lori, do you have anything to say about like fantasy tropes? Because obviously fantasy is full of many different tropes, and like I can imagine that it can be easy in that genre to like try to like have to. It can be challenging to avoid the sort of exotification of certain, or Asian or.
Right. I love fantasy tropes, frankly. I think possibly every single fantasy book out there is made up of tropes. It just like set into different specific scenarios, different specific settings and characters and whatnot, right? So like with Forest of Souls, I deliberately wanted to play with tropes, but with Asian coded characters. Like that was like very deliberate, because going back, to what we said about how we didn't see ourselves in fantasy, I loved these stories and I love these tropes, and I wanted to I wanted to carve that spot out for Asians and Asian Americans specifically, diaspora Asians specifically, because I wanted to see myself in a Western medieval style fantasy, which is what I grew up with. Like I don't consider myself, well, no, a better way to say this is like I'm very much Hmong American, right? Very much Hmong and very much American. Like I am not either one or the other. So what I did with Force of Souls is that it's very deliberately like a world that is similar to the Western medieval fantasy style, but with some Hmong cultural influences in it. So it's like a marriage of the two, which, which I just felt was more representative of me as a person, but also with like a lot of the fantasy tropes that I love, like the assassin and the spy in training, and like the wise elder who is a mentor, and whatever, right? Because I love these tropes. I didn't see myself in them, so I definitely subverted some of them, but I also just really wanted to play with them. And I really wanted to tell diaspora Asian teens that we belong in these worlds and these are ours as much as they are white kids.
So I think that we might need to sort of go on to our last question since we're nearing the hour. Can you believe that? But I guess I'll make it a two-part question. So someone asked about what are some other stories you hope to see more in Kidlit, and Deeba, you can specifically, if you want, talk about your manuscript wish list, and the rest of us can talk about, what we hope for. I'm gonna sort of combine a couple of the last questions, what we're hoping that we're creating in our writing in terms of a legacy for future generations, and then also recommend a couple more AAPI books for everybody's ever-growing TBRs. Deeba, you want to start?
Sure. So my manuscript wish list, God, it's really long, but I'm not going to go into all of it. But definitely, what I really want to see more of in Kidlit is definitely, more stories that center Muslim protagonists, pretty much as the heroes of their own stories across all genres. I just feel like currently the stories that we have that center Muslim protagonists, I feel like for a long time were very issue driven and very and I'm not to say that they're not important, because they are important stories, because that is a very important narrative. But what I've realized is when it's the only narrative, it becomes something that's more of an expectation. Whenever you see a description about a book that says Muslim character, your mind automatically jumps to this is an issue story, or this is a war story, or this is something that has to do with some sort of oppression regarding to the character's Muslim identity. And so what I would like to see more is more Muslim characters living like slice of life stories, in rom-coms, in thrillers. I mean, how great would I tweeted this out before, but like I'm looking for like an Islamic school thriller with unreliable characters, and just like basically genres that you don't normally see Muslim teens in, just basically kicking butt and getting the guy, or, going on the quest, saving the world, essentially, is what I'm really hoping for.
So I have some recommendations for slice of life for rom-coms. S.K. Ali's Love from A to Z,
Yes.
which is just wonderful. And, it's funny, I actually was just in a chat with her a couple of days ago, and she was saying how she wanted to just write a fluffy rom-com, but actually it ended up talking about a lot of really dark, deep issues, which I think is another example of how complex and layered these stories can be. Like, you can talk about Islamophobia, but still have it be sort of a happy, almost, a happy typical rom-com. So that's one. And the other one that is on my TBR is The Weight of Our Sky by Hannah Alkoff, which is about the Malaysian race riots that my family fled from. So please add this to your.
It's a beautiful book. I love it. It's like one of my favorite books.
I would like to recommend really anything written by Stacey Lee, but her latest one is The Downstairs Girl. Stacey writes historical fiction, and I have all of them here. I'll show you them all because they're beautiful, and Stacey's amazing. And she, Under a Painted Sky, Outrun the Moon, yeah, and Secret of a Heart Now, and The Downstairs Girl all are YA historicals, and they kind of delve into these little pockets of Chinese immigrants in America. So one is kind of on the Oregon Trail, and one is in the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, and The Downstairs Girl is in like 1890 Atlanta. And so I think it's so wonderful to see how long we've been here and kind of in all the different contexts that we've been here as well. And they are, I feel, perhaps less issue driven and more like just slice of life from this little corner of history. And then on my to be read list is Prairie, Lotus by Linda Sue Park. I've heard amazing things about this, and kind of that it's a biracial, so a half white, half Asian girl, kind of Little House on the Prairie style. And I grew up in gold rush country in California, and so I'm very interested kind of in this kind of gold rushy era, and Asian Americans in that context as well. So those are, love Stacey Lee, very excited about Prairie Lotus.
Can we recommend Kat Cho's Wicked Fox, which is amazing. It's also contemporary fantasy. I would call it contemporary fantasy. I don't know. I feel like that genre is kind of, we use it loosely, but it's contemporary. I would call it contemporary fantasy, which is fantastic.
But also shapeshiftery and like thrillery, and so.
And romancy.
Yes.
Yes.
Exactly. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I feel like we could go on for another, how many hours on this topic? But hopefully this is just a starting off point, and there will be many more discussions to come. And don't forget to check out the rest of our panels this month. There are another 2 weeks of them.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
all.
you, everybody.